everybody. Welcome back. It's your girl Toyzilla with another episode of Toyzilla Streams Book Club. Yeah, you're so good at reading, Toya. Your pronunciation is excellent. Thank you. Y'all so nice. All right, now. So, what we got for y'all is continuing the Looking Glass Wars by Frank Better. I really love this trilogy. Again, it's I guess they call it one of those fractured fairy tales. So just think of it as the true story of Alice in Wonderland. That's what I really like it. Last time we left off on chapter 18, and that was the end of part 1 of the book. So now we'll be diving in part 2. So we'll do chapters 19, 20, and 21 for this one. If you haven't seen any of the previous ones, then what I'd like y'all to do is go onto our YouTube page, Toyzilla. Just look for the Bearbot logo, and you'll find the rest of the chapters there. All right. And if y'all, one last thing to mention. While we're reading along, if you guys want to draw some pictures of what's just coming to your mind about what's happening in the story, because it's a chapter book, not too many pictures. So, yeah, I'd just love to see what you guys come up with. Let's be creative. Let's have a good time together. All right, now, y'all. Part 2, chapter 19. Let's start. In a region somewhere between the everlasting forest and outer wilderbeestia, remarkable only for its desolation, Wonderlanders who not long before had been law-abiding, family-loving folk, slaved away in Red's most notorious labor camp, Black-Sick. Having fallen into the Queen's ill favor, they worked in unventilated factory rooms for 17 hours a day on nothing more than water and inflorice, a food-flavored, working, okay, I'm going to start that sentence over. Having fallen into the Queen's ill favor, they worked in unventilated factory rooms for 17 hours a day on nothing more than water and inflorice, a food favored by the poor because each grain inflated in the stomach, making the recipient feel full. It had been decreed that every Wonderlander was to have a 3-foot-high porcelain and a crystal statue of Red in his residence, the set piece in a shrine to the Queendom's ruler. Surprise spot checks by Red soldiers were not uncommon. Those in violation of the decree, anyone whose statue was not in pristine condition, found themselves hauled off to Black-Sick, where, in a bit of irony, Rand found pleasing, they were forced to make the statues until death descended upon them. But tonight something was wrong. Production of the statues had been interrupted by a rebel attack. Periodic explosions rattled camp dormitories. Flares zoomed through the night, illuminating figures engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Card soldiers from Red's technologically advanced ultra-modern army, known as the Cut, were trying to fend off the attack, which shouldn't have been so difficult considering that the rebels were nothing more than a hodgepodge of ex-Heart soldiers and Wonderland civilians. But the rebels had righteous anger working for them, which could be a better weapon than mere combat skills, and among them was one who suddenly split in two so as to lend an extra body to the fight. Generals Doppel and Ganger, battling alongside a white knight, a white rook, and several pawns. The rebels called themselves Alicents in honor of the young princess who'd been killed before her time, never to ascend to the throne. Princess Alice Hart, not alive in flesh and blood, but very much alive as a symbol of more innocent, though still imperfect times. An icon of hope for peace's return. Among the Alicents, one particular soldier was making a name for himself with his growing military prowess and suicidal bravery. If this renegade didn't always mix with his rebel brethren, if he kept to himself when not engaged in battle, at least he was on their side. Better to have him as a friend than an enemy, as anyone who'd seen him fight well knew. It was this renegade who broke away from the cover of the other rebels at the Battle of Blacksik. Without concern for his own well-being, and with sword glinting, he slashed his way through red soldiers, who looked like ordinary playing cards, albeit larger when unengaged, but who now fanned out as if the hand of a giant poker player was spreading them across the green baize of a gaming table. Each card flipped open to form a soldier almost twice the height of an average Wonderland male, with limbs of steel and a brain that understood little more than how to follow orders in combat. One by one, the renegade aimed the point of his blade at the soldier's upper chest, their single vulnerable spot, a medallion-sized area above the breastplate at the base of the steel-tendon neck. A direct a direct hit cut through vital inner workings and sent sparks flying, killing them. He fired a cannonball spider at the doors of the factory. In midair, it mutated from ball to massive black spider and tore through the doors. As the renegades slashed and hacked at red soldiers, the slave workers were able to flee across the plain into the everlasting forests. A burning dormitory illuminated the renegade's face, handsome and rugged, with 4 parallel scars visible on his right cheek. Dodge Anders. Only 14 years old, but fighting like a grown man. A handful of years had passed since Red's initial invasion of Heart Palace, and the chaos that resulted from her takeover of the queendom had settled into a new order. Upon hearing of Red's coup and fearing the kind of ruler she'd be, many citizens had immediately packed their bags and tried to immigrate to Borderland, the independent country separated from Wonderland by the tangled expanse of outer wildebeestia and overseen by King Arch. But whether these would-be immigrants didn't bribe Borderland's border officials generously enough, or Red had anticipated an exodus among the cowards of the population and made an agreement with King Arch, no one was able to leave. All were stuck in Wonderland, forced to endure the teeth of Red's anger. Entire families were shipped off to labor camps or, worse, exterminated. Others, who hadn't attempted to flee the country but nonetheless had issues with Red being queen, heard about the Allisons and fled what they knew of a normal life to join the resistance. Red chose to rule the queendom from her fortress on Mount Isolation. The fortress served as a constant reminder of her years in exile and unjust banishment at the hands of her dear departed sister, and thus was a spur to her ruthless methods. Soon after her coronation, the very hush-hush, Red had the heart crystal move to the fortress, and she could feel it now, shimmering in its secret chamber, as she paced back and forth, listening to Bibwood Hare recite pages of In Queendom Sparamus, which she was rewriting, the tutor acting as her secretary. The queendom had always been a naive, optimistic place, Bibwood read. It was as if Wonderland were run by girls and boys. By children, Red corrected. By children who had yet to put away their childish toys and face the harsh realities of the universe. Good, Red said. Now continue. A universe in which only the cruelest survive. A Jabberwock eat Jabberwock universe, so to speak. The pointed tip of Bibwood's quill scurried across the royal papyrus. The cats entered the room. Yes? Red asked. The cat hissed. Blacksix has fallen and the slaves escaped. The Allisons were responsible. Red clenched her fists. Items around the room began to quiver. The Allisons. A boil on the face of her reign. A thorn in the fist of her rule. Why hadn't the cut done away with them already? Weapons and furnishings, anything not bolted down, shook with her mounting fury. Knowing her intolerance for failure, the Bedwood Heart and the cat hurried from the room. Yeah! Red yelled, standing at the center of the whirling chairs, lamps, swords, spears, platters, and books. A tornado brought forth from the bottomless well of her hateful imagination. Black-sick attacked? Slaves freed? Heads were going to roll. In the aftermath of the Black-sick battle, their adrenaline still pumping, Dodge and the White Rook braved the walk through the teeming urban slum Wonderland had become to remind themselves why they fought. The Rook camouflaged himself in a hooded coat, but Dodge refused to do likewise. He would not hide who he was from his enemies. I remember when Wonderlanders actually cared for this city, the Rook said as they picked their way along a sidewalk choked with litter. Streets were clean, roads swept. The curbside shrubs and flowers were always humming bouncy tunes. He glanced at the curb. Nothing but weeds and long dead growth. All vegetation silent, killed by naturecide. A chemical Red had concocted specifically for that purpose. And you could get a hot, fresh tarty tart on every corner. I miss tarty tarts. Dodge nodded. He had his own memories. The glittering quartz-like buildings of Genevieve's time. The twinkling colors of towers and spires, regularly cleaned and polished. Wonderland had been a gleaming, incandescent place, filled for the most part with hard-working, law-respecting citizens. Now everything was covered with grime and soot. Poverty and crime had oozed out of the back alleys and taken over the main streets, and anything bright and luminescent had to hide itself away in the nooks and crannies of the city. Let's cross the street, the Rook suggested. Dodge saw why. Ahead of them, a fight had broken out. Two emancipated Wonderlanders attacking a third. Probably an imagination stimulant deal gone bad. Dodge and the Rook could never walk more than a few streets without witnessing a brawl. It was best not to approach, to not draw attention to themselves. They crossed the street and came to a corner crowded with smoky, wormy kebab grills and crystal smugglers hawking contraband. Dodge tried to call to his senses the aroma of freshly baked tarty tarts. Hadn't his father bought him one on this very corner? His sense memory failed him. Impossible to enter into the past. Underneath the shouts and horns that echoed through the streets, he heard a disembodied voice speaking red isms from loudspeakers mounting overhead. The red way is the right way. As in the beginning there was red, so in the end red shall be. Three-dimensional faces on holographic billboards told of the latest crackdowns and taxations. Piped in from who knew where played the background music of Wondertropolis' free fall into decay. It seemed to come from every crack in the pavement, every pothole in the street, every crevice in the time-battered buildings. A composition on infinite repeat. Featuring lyrics Red had written herself, which sang her praises as Wonderland's savior. I'd like to hear silence again, Dodge said. A whole day's worth of quiet. Do you remember what that was like? Yes, but you know how it is. The Rook did his best imitation of Red. Silence is hereby outlawed. Silence breeds independent thought, which in turn breeds dissent. Not that there were many true dissenters, as they both knew. Those disloyal to Red were quickly rooted out of the general population, never to be heard from again. The Black Stick battle was growing more distant in their minds, their blood cooling. They had their choice of places to visit, provided they were careful. How about a Jabberwocky match? Suggested the Rook. At the amphitheater, they could watch the huge, ferocious beasts go at each other with a teeth-gnashing hatred, rivaled only by which audience members felt for one another. Mm. Dodge shook his head. Fights always break out, and I don't like the feeling I get when we slip away without at least injuring a few of Red's soldiers. The statue, then? Again, Dodge shook his head. The Queen Red statue stood at the city's western edge, where from the observation deck, Dodge could gaze out throughout the eyes of this enormous agate replica of the city spread below. It sometimes helped his vengeance to imagine himself in the Queen's skull, but not today. Let's just walk, he said. They passed the boarded up shop fronts in Red Plaza, the pawn shops and moneylenders in Red Square, and the mammoth complex of Red Towers apartments whose advertising slogan, "If you lived here, you'd be home by now," did little to fill vacancies. They stopped in at Red's Hotel and Casino, where, in addition to gambling with Crystal, Wonderlanders could bet their lives on a single roll of the dice. Dodge picked up his Dodge picked up his pace when they passed Hart Palace, now fallen into disrepair and occupied by stimulant-addled squatters on their way to the Five Spires of Red construction site. Her imperial viciousness had promised that the Five Spires of Red would be the tallest structure ever erected in the universe, a vertical column of steel sheathed in spiked and mottled crystal, rising magnificently into the sky and topped with five-pointed spires like the fingers and thumb of the Queen herself. "Do you think she'll finish it?" the Rook asked. Dodge tensed. "I don't think we should give it a chance." Everywhere they went, they saw signs urging Wonderlanders to attend meetings of the numberless Black Imagination Societies that now flourished in every banqueting hall, while the few White Imagination Societies were forced to gather in stealth and secret. Anyone exposed as a practitioner of White Imagination was sentenced to a slow, work-slogged death, shipped off to the crystal mines, just as practitioners of Black Imagination had been in Genevieve's time. But whereas then the emphasis had been on hard work and repentance, where the chance for freedom, prisoners were now purposely worked past all endurance. "What sort of world is this?" the Rook asked angry. "Where neighbors and friends inform on one another, where children, mad at their parents because they didn't get a Black Imagination starters kit for their birthday, can complain to the nearest lieutenant from the cut saying they've heard their parents claim Red isn't the rightful ruler of the queendom, and then their parents are hauled off to face unmentionable tortures, and I'm sure Red doesn't care if they tell the truth." "She probably prefers it if they don't," Dodge said. The Rook nodded, again imitated Red. "Because it's much more Black Imagination. My reign thrives on deceit and violence and uncertainty." "She probably prefers it if they don't," Dodge said. My bad. I reread that. Okay. "My reign thrives on deceit and violence and uncertainty." The Rook sniffled in disgust. Different laws for different people. A member of the Spades or Clubs, he avoids being shipped to the mines with a generous donation to the Queen's personal crystal account, whereas for the average Wonderlander, there's no hope. It's off to the mines he goes. They turned their footsteps in the direction of the everlasting forest. They had seen enough. "I'll tell you what sort of world this is," the Rook said, answering his own question. "It's one that can't last." "No," Dodge said. But he was no longer thinking of the rise and fall of queens and the corruption of general populations. He was thinking of something more personal. His motivation for getting up in the morning. Assassination of the cat. Chapter 20. Whew. Hatter Madigan left Paris with 32 hours of escaping the Palais de Justice and scoured the country in search of Alice. After weeks of fruitless searching, he arrived in the Principality of Monaco on the Mediterranean coast. It was mid-August, the peak of summer. He hadn't yet visited a single hat shop when he was walking down a side street near the beach and heard a passing gentleman exclaim to a companion, "Oh, regardez cela! Pauvre petit chapeau hat de faune." Again, I do not know the language. I don't know what they're saying. If you know, please help us. Please help me. Thank you. Goodbye. Hatter had picked up enough French to know that chapeau meant hat. As the men continued on their way, he turned for a glimpse of the headwear in question and saw a top hat floating in the middle of a puddle. He knew in a moment it was his hat. How had it gotten there? Hatter examined the puddle. It should have been evaporated. It should have been evaporating in the heat, but he could tell by its edges that it wasn't. An evaporating puddle would have had a ring of damp around it, indicating its original size before the effects of the sun. Hatter had studied his share of puddles during his time in this world, wondering which of them, if any, might take him back to Wonderland once he was reunited with Princess Alice. There had been nothing telltale about any of them, nothing signifying their use as a return portal. But this one, careful not to step in it, he bent down and picked up the hat. It was soaked, but it looked all right. He flicked his wrists. There they were, the S-shaped blades. So the weapon still worked. With another wrist flick, the blades morphed back into a dripping top hat, which Hatter put on his head, tapping the crown as might a dandy adding the final touch to his wardrobe before heading out for a night of frolic and fun. As a test, Hatter picked up a stone and dropped it into the puddle. Kerwoosh! The water sucked it down and out of sight. Could this be a return puddle? Might the Pool of Tears, the only means out of Wonderland, have many return puddles? Various portal routes connecting it to like tentacles to the head of an octopus? And what if Alice had discovered one of them? A puddle situated where no water should naturally have been, and traveled back to Wonderland. It was unlikely, since no one who'd entered the Pool of Tears had ever yet returned. But Alice was not your average Pool of Tears traveler. She wasn't average in anything. If she had returned, she would not survive long. She didn't have the training, her imaginative muscle unexercised, and red wouldn't stand for it. Hatter flattened his top hat into blades, aligning them in a stack to make them as compact as possible. He tucked the weapon into a secure, thick-lined pocket inside his coat. He had no intention of losing it again. But what if his theory was wrong? What if this puddle led to some unknown destination instead of back to Wonderland? Stepping into it was a serious risk. For Alice's sake and for that of the Queendom, it was one he had to take. Chapter 21. After the temper subsides and one has a moment to calmly reflect, it isn't uncommon for declarations shouted in a fit of rage to strike one as untrue, and because they may have been hurtful to family, friends, lovers, husbands, or wives, one wishes them unsaid. But this was not the case with 11-year-old Alice Hart, who had waited with impatience for the Reverend Charles Dodgson to complete the book describing her life in Wonderland, all the while entertaining visions of comeuppance for those who doubted her. When Dodgson at last presented her with a copy of the book during a picnic of cold chicken and salad along the River Cherwell, and she discovered it had little to do with her, and that he'd purposely twisted everything she told him into nonsense. How could he? A vicious joke? Anger filled her to the tips of her fingers. If If her talk of Wonderland wasn't fantasy, it might as well have been, for all the hurt and trouble it had caused her. She meant exactly what she said and never once, in all the years afterward, regretted it. You're the cruelest man I've ever met, Mr. Dodgson, and if you had believed a single word I told you, you know how very cruel that is. I never want to see you again. Never, never, never. She left Dodgson on the riverbank, perplexed, and ran the entire way home. She stomped into the hall and slammed the door behind her, surprising Mrs. Liddell. What, back already? But Alice, her face twisted with grief and rage, didn't stop. A cruel, vicious man. What am I supposed to do now? Can't live as Aunt Alice. She took the stairs two at a time up to her room and locked the door. Alice, Mrs. Liddell called, following her. Where are Edith and Lorena? Where's Mr. Dodgson? What's happened? But Alice wouldn't say, nor would she come out of her room. She didn't hear Mrs. Liddell knocking at the door, the annoyed but futile turning of the doorknob, or the imperious demand, Alice, open the door! Open it this minute! The blood roared in her veins, and suddenly she was ripping the drawings of heart palettes off her walls a fistful at a time, tearing them into confetti. No more. Erase it all. I will no longer be Odd Alice. Odd Alice must die. Yes, it was a solution. Give up her so-called ridiculous, fantastical delusions and enter wholeheartedly into the world around her. Become just like everyone else. Listen. Mrs. Liddell was no longer accosting the door to her room. She heard voices downstairs. Dodgson and her sisters must have returned. The beastly man. Alice, come downstairs, Mrs. Liddell called. Mr. Dodgson is here. I won't see him. Thinking afresh of what he'd done, remembering the feel of his idiotic book in her hands, she became enraged all over again. He tricked me, a man with a heart of ice, and kicked at the heaps of confetti lying on the floor. What was... Something had moved in the looking glass. Not a reflection of herself, of anything in the room. No. It was Genevieve, dressed as Alice last remembered her, but without her crown. Never forget who you are, Alice, Genevieve said. Shut up, Alice cried and threw a pillow at the looking glass. Her mother, or whoever the woman in the mirror was, had never been through what she'd had to do with these last 4 years. The mirror was suddenly empty, reflecting only the room. But of course nobody had been in the mirror. How stupid. Her imagination had been playing tricks on her. Exhausted, Alice dropped to the floor, sobbing. Before long, she fell asleep amidst the scraps of paper palaces. When she emerged from her room the next morning, a room perfectly clean, no confetti on the floor, no sign of the violence done in its hours earlier, the Liddells were at breakfast in the dining room. They immediately noticed a change in Alice without being able to pinpoint what it was. Edith and Lorena fell still, mid-chew, their open mouths revealing a mash of scrambled eggs. Dean Liddell paused in the midst of buttering his scone, and Mrs. Liddell continued pouring tea into her cup even after it spilled over onto the saucer. Not until the servant started to clean it up did she notice what she'd done. You're wearing the dress? Mrs. Liddell said. The dress she had purchased months before, but which Alice had always refused to wear because she feared it would make her appear common. Yes, Mother. But that wasn't it. It didn't account for the change. You look rather lovely, said Dean Liddell. Thank you, Father. The change was in subtler things, the tilt of Alice's head, the particular sweep of her arms, her careful steps forward. The Liddells were so taken with her appearance that they failed to realize it was the first time she had ever called them by those most intimate of endearments. mother, and father. All right. That's the end of chapter 21, everybody. Thank y'all for sticking with us this long. Tomorrow's Friday, so there will be 3 more chapters read. Y'all know how it goes. We start the game at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then after we've had our fun on Crash Bandicoot, maybe some Fall Guys, then we do our couple of chapters for book club. But, if you don't want to sit through all the gaming, I do upload the videos after, and you can find them on YouTube. You search for Toyzilla, and you look for my Bearbot logo. Y'all remember what it is. Again, if y'all ever want to draw some art and send them in to me, I'd love to see it. I would love to. Just comment under the videos below, and I'll let y'all know how to reach me. So until next time, I can't wait to finish the story with you. This has been Toyzilla's Book Club. Goodbye, everybody. Toyzilla is out.